Good evening and welcome to What's Your Story? My guest today is Gary Robinson. The earliest Methodist church in New Britain was built at the corner of Main and Walnut Streets in 1828. It was replaced by a larger building in 1854. This was in turn replaced by a new Trinity United Methodist Church located on the east side of Main Street. The new granite Richardsonian Romanesque church, designed by Amos P. Cutting of Worcester, was built in 1889 to 1891. By 2000, the congregation could not afford the costly repairs the building required and voted to demolish it. Local citizens formed a committee to save the church, which has now become Trinity on Main, a nonprofit art center, education facility, community space, and venue for events. This is the story of a man's love for architecture and his passion for preserving history. Gary, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Tell us a bit about your background. How did you become involved in the effort to save the church from demolition?
Well, the building was, as you point out, was in the process of being demolished. I knew a bunch of people in town. I was involved at one point with a group called Leadership New Britain. And as such, I knew a lot of the people who were involved in the community, one of which was on this committee that was appointed to save the building. This was officially known as New Britain Area Council of Churches. And New morphed into a committee to save 69 Main Street. Mostly it was church folks. Mostly these people were gathering around and trying to come up with a way to preserve it as a church. And really what they came up with was the idea of being a condominium church, so that you would rent it for a couple hours, I might rent it for a couple hours, and run our parishes through that building. And everybody loved the idea, except they wanted their building to be the condominium, and we could tear down all the other buildings. So it really didn't work. So the long and short of it, they were going around in circles, and one of them had spoken to an architect friend of mine, a guy by the name of Jeffrey Bray, who's a local architect and very much interested in history. And Jeffrey invited me to go take a look at the space, and he and I did, and met the pastor, who's quite an interesting character, and came to the point that we might be able to help these people. I was the president of a group called Vision New Britain, and Vision New Britain was an outcropping of Vision 2000. In the 1990s, there were a lot of these vision groups sort of looking at what we could do for the community down the road. And at that point, we got involved with this and invited them to become a participating group within Vision. So they now had a structure. We were a tax-exempt organization, so they could go get some money to do some research. Did enough research to find out that the building was structurally sound, could stand up for a few more years, and that we probably could turn it into some facility for performing arts that could then be used in the community. So I'd have a purpose, a renewal purpose, rather than as a church. The church physically left the building. They moved into an adjacent attached building that they had built in the 60s when the church was going real great and they needed more classroom space. So they built a classroom building, which they later rented out and ultimately moved into before the demise of the congregation. So the committee to save 69 Main Street got all these sort of things in place. The church agreed to sell us the property if we could come up with the money they wanted. And we found, through then Congresswoman Nancy Johnson, some funding. And Nancy Johnson was just a peach relative to getting this thing done.
Yes.
Found the money. We ultimately bought the building and inherited all of the maintenance problems that exist therewith.
Absolutely, yes. So how did you personally become involved?
Only because somebody said, can you help us out? And my problem in life often is I don't know how to say no. So it's pretty easy. People always say to me, how do you get involved? And I say, all you have to do is say yes. There's always an opportunity to get involved.
Now, is it correct that Amos Cutting was the architect of the building?
Yeah, well, I wasn't around when he was there. But,
absolutely, yeah.
But Amos was a very famous architect. If you see some of his work on the internet, there's a lot of churches that he built up in the Massachusetts, Vermont area. And he was had been around for many years, worked for several firms, and had this whole Romanesque, kind of Richardson Romanesque attitude towards granite and towards building buildings with multicolored stone. Some of them are reddish granite, some of them are this dark granite as we have. And they used offsetting lighter stone to create different patterns in the building. The interior of the building, I mean, from what I read in the history, I really wish I knew what the real dollar value was when they built it, because it's almost impossible to find. And I've yet to come across a document. I've never seen anything that mentions a number that even approaches $100,000. But it's beyond my comprehension, even in those days, considering 1890s, that kind of money was there.
So is that what it cost, $100,000 to build?
Well, that I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking it was probably more like $500,000 is my guess. But as I say, when you look at mortgages and they talk about retiring $7,000 mortgages, I mean, it's pretty hard to build a $100,000 or $200,000 building and have a $7,000 mortgage. But long and short of it is our estimate now, if we had to replace the building and start from scratch, if we could find the right craftsmen, which is always a question. There were a dozen named craftsmen from the area that worked on the property.
Now, excuse me, by craftsmen, do you mean people that do work on the exterior or the interior, or both?
Both.
Yes.
I mean, the stonemasons that did it, I mean, you're talking about a tower that's 100+ feet tall.
Yes.
Consider that you built that when we didn't have cranes and we didn't have power tools.
Quite a magnificent
You're talking about a lot of work.
Yeah.
And there's actually one feature in the basement. There's a piece of stone in the basement, and I just always get the feeling that they just ran out of energy and couldn't take any more stone out. And it's an outcropping through one of the floors down there, so it's pretty interesting. But the interior was 3 or 4 local people, and there's still to this day a John Boyle a paint store and decorating store, and there's a John Boyle that was involved in the staining of the building. So I don't know if that family tradition carried through all that 100+ years. So. But it was quite a magnificent feature. A lot of people worked on it.
I can imagine the history that passed through that church, the community and the communities that came together to worship in that particular structure. And as you say, I have been there. I've had the privilege of seeing it. The interior was magnificent. So could you talk a little bit about the beauty of the interior of it?
I always sort of, when I'm there for shows in the evening most of the time, and you can always tell the new people because as they walk in, their eyes and their head turn to the ceiling.
Exactly, yes.
And we have the main entry hall. We refer to it as the Welcome Hall, which is what I think they called it. It was also the Sunday school area. Is a roundish kind of building, a rotunda in our definition, has a balcony. And that is all gorgeous woodwork. The patina of the woodwork is superb. You've got some pictures. For
our audience who may not know, what's patina?
That's the color, if you will, or the tone of the wood. And as that works, when you go into the main building, the doors are pocket doors that in all my 15-odd years of being involved in this project, I have never seen any maintenance on these doors. And you can open and close these doors. They're big barn doors. You can open and close them with absolutely no effort at all. And we used to have a problem in the summer months in August when the wood swelled a little bit. You couldn't do it. But as you walk into the main theater now, the former sanctuary, the ceiling height is about 55 or 60 feet. And the first thing people do is roll their head up to look at this. And the more light that's on it, the more interesting it becomes. I think you have some photographs, and our website has some photographs.
Absolutely, yes.
Well worth taking a look at them.
Did you ever have an opportunity to worship at that facility? Or?
No, I'm a latecomer to New Britain.
To that,
I mean, I showed up in New Britain in the early 70s.
Okay, yeah.
Born and raised in New York City, so I see New Britain as the country. And so from that standpoint, I never had a real involvement. The pastor that was there, he and I got along quite well. Our first pastor, he unfortunately died shortly after all this started. But he was a late to the clergy, former businessman, great guy to chat with, and he was just looking to keep the building alive. And we had the mayor at the time was Lucian Pavlak, who's now back as a registrar of voters. And Lucian's tone was, you can tie me to the wrecking ball, you can't tear it down. So that was his posture on this thing. And we were able to save it. spending a fair amount of time in Europe, you look at people live in houses that are 150 and 200 years old.
Absolutely, yes.
And in this country, we see 40 years old as time to replace and renew. So
how do you think that is? What do you think that is? Where did that come from?
Well, I think it was just, let's be modern. I think is that, and I go back to the 60s, and we tore down all these buildings. There were some apparently very great theaters in the center of New Britain, the Palace Theater among them, and people talk about how much splendor there was. And I think the Warner Theater in Torrington and the Palace in Waterbury, when you look at those buildings, they were fortunately saved, and just the feeling that you get when you walk into them, the opulence of the space is incredible. So to me, saving these older buildings, not because they're old, but because they have character, because they have all of this craftsmanship in them that is almost impossible to replace today.
I was going to ask you about that, the craftsmanship for the interior. Is it hard to find people with those skills today?
I think so. I mean, you can find some good cabinet makers, and some of these folks can do this stuff. But when you look at the magnitude, I mean, this is a 9,000 square foot facility.
Yes.
And you look at the woodwork that's all over. I mean, the ceiling on it, I always think of it as being a Viking ship that came here and nobody wanted to take it home, so they turned it over and used that as the roof, because all these beautiful pieces of wood up there. And the height of it is incredible. I mean, we went to put some window shades up in some of the windows at the high end. And I mean, we had scaffolding and ladders and just almost impossible to get up there. And yet these folks had ways to do this. Maybe they had wings, I don't know. But
still blows your mind how they got it done.
Absolutely amazing.
Yeah. Now, is there stained glass? Was Tiffany involved in that, or do we know?
No, I don't think it was Tiffany. But the stained glass in the building, there's a great story about that. There's two round arch-shaped panels in the building. And one time we had a memorial service going on. This was early on, and I was in the back of the theater, and there were a young couple sitting down on one side. Most of the people were in the center. And all of a sudden, I heard a piece of glass drop. And it turns out the window on the one side of the building, the south side, where the sun shone mostly,
yes,
what had happened is the lead kind of gave way and the weather kind of gave way. And the window tilted in from the elements. And a chunk of this glass was 1/4 inch thick, and this had fallen down, never broke. And I always laughed because I handed it to the guys that redid the windows some years later, and they put it back in place.
It fell down and it didn't break?
Didn't break.
Ouch.
So, yeah.
How far did it fall from?
40 feet.
My goodness.
So, this stuff was significant. They took the window out, covered it with plywood while they took it out to fix it. It took 4 men to get it down. All kinds of scaffolding. Amazing piece of work just to get it up and down. But it's that we've done probably 15 or 20% of the stained glass, the worst of the worst, that was really ready to go. And this was one of the windows that we replaced. So, but
excuse me, do you know if the schools bring any children to the building to begin to appreciate the architecture and the history of the buildings, or the history in our culture in those types of structures? It would seem to me that you'd want to get the young people involved into it so that it can carry forward.
We do some school programs there. I wish we would do more. There are some life safety issues in the building with, when you start bringing a bunch of school children in, and you need to make sure you have all the right entrances and all the right kind of security things with fire alarm systems. And we've done over the years a great deal of work with fire alarm systems, with life safety issues. And we do bring kids in. I mean, we do bring them in often for concerts, but the school system is reluctant to transport them because they've got to pay for those buses. And that's always a big issue.
It's always an issue, yeah.
So they'd rather have us bring stuff to the schools than bring the schools out to see these things.
Mr. Robinson, why is it important to preserve buildings like Trinity? Why?
Well, I think for people to see the history. I think for people to see the difference between now the very modern, very modern police station across the street, a $15 million building that was built some 8 or 10 years ago. And the window that reflect on the building reflects Trinity on Main when the sunlight is right. And it's just such a great view. Just across the street, you have a building that's 100 years old and one that's 10 years old. And my guess is that the church is apt to be there longer than the new police station.
Now, for the nuts and bolts, I don't really understand, and perhaps my viewing audience would find this helpful. Insurance for that structure. Could you talk a little bit about what that must be like?
Well, I mean, to try to insure it fully to replace it, I mean, the nearest estimate we have is $12 to $15 million to replace the building. If we were to start from scratch or with the foundation somewhere in there,
yes,
that's the kind of number we're talking about. I mean, people were willing to come when they looked at demolishing the property. People were willing to come for no charge, take the building down, take away all the materials, all the wood, all the stained glass,
yeah,
all the stone, and give the church people $100,000 in cash and a grassy knoll. So there had to be a reasonable value for somebody to take the time to tear all that stuff down to reuse it. There had to be a value in just the presence of that stone and the glass and the wood. So it's clearly something that would be almost impossible to rebuild today, I think. So to insure it, you know, what can we do? You know, you can, little water damage, they're not going to pay for that. So it really gets to be catastrophic insurance, and the price of that is outlandish. So.
It would seem to me that there would be some interest in insurance industries or like-minded industries to preserve culture that they would love to. But I imagine that's not the driving force, is it?
Well, yeah, we're all looking to make a dollar.
That's right. I understand completely. Are there any other buildings in New Britain equally as historical as Trinity?
Well, certainly across the street is South Church, and that's they were much better endowed than the Trinity group, and they've been able to maintain their building, and it's fairly substantial. It's probably more substantial, made out of brownstone, mostly out of the quarries in Portland. So that's another good example right in downtown. But a lot of the original older buildings, even City Hall was originally a hotel, and a building next to it was a hotel, the Bird Hotel as well. So we do have a fair amount of historic interest in
City Hall used to be a hotel.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes, yes, and there've been some additions done to it and some changes. The Gates building where the Board of Education is, again, right next to City Hall.
Yes.
And just down the street from us, again, was an historic building that was, I'm not sure what its use was, but these were buildings that were built in the 1800s, early 1900s. So there's a lot of that history there.
Okay. Who would you guess, if you've not been able to find historically, who would you guess were the actual workers who built that building?
Well, there were contractors that came out of Farmington and Waterbury, and I just have to believe they were plenty of people in New Britain in those days that were of the crafts. I mean, the factories alone attracted all kinds of
Sure.
people to them. So, I mean, Stanley and Corbin, all of these buildings that were there, those kind of craftspeople were more or less in the area. Whether or not they were the ones constructing the building, I don't know. But the church people, over time, their interest in life was mostly to maintain the building. And, you know, well, I do a little electrical work, I'll do that. And you do a little carpentry work, so you'll fix that. And it was never the same quality. It was never really done to building codes. So, we still have issues with the fire department about some of the space in the building, how we use it and when we use it. And we have a liquor license, so by default, these guys show up every year to do an inspection. And it's, every year it's something else. I mean, the fire extinguishers have to get brought up to date, or the emergency lighting isn't right, or the smoke detectors didn't work someplace. So every year they come in, every year it's another few dollars to take care of those problems. Rightfully so, but it's still an expense that's hard to budget for.
So do you go out to local places and talk about the history and how you got to preserve that building?
We do, not just myself. I mean, there's a fair group of people that were involved in the project. Many of the original committee to save 69 Main Street are still involved. One or two of them are still on the board of directors. So we do have there's a certain amount of continuity there. For a while, we had a paid staff that really ran the place quite differently, and unfortunately, the money just ran out. It's very difficult to keep it going. And I've been there as a volunteer manager of the building for some years now, and we'd love nothing more than have a paid staff that you don't have to depend on whether they feel like coming to work or not.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah. So. Are there any grants available, or?
Operational grants are hard to get. Usually they're interested in seed money 3 or 4 years, and then you're on your own.
Okay.
We've gotten to the place where it's reasonably self-sustaining. We pay the electric bill and the heat bill and all of those things out of door receipts, and operational income. So from that standpoint, we're doing fine. But now when you start talking about replacing a roof that's $750,000 to $1 million, that's not going to come through the door on ticket sales. It's
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So we really need support, and that usually comes in the form of government support, block grant money. State's been involved in the project. So where there's large bills like that, we plead our case to the legislators and see what they can do to help us out.
Do you have any idea who the most famous people were to ever attend that church? Any idea at all?
The classic one is a local family, the Brown family. The daughter married a guy who ultimately became the president of Schweppes Cadbury in England. And they recently have come back to this country. They live in Florida more of the year than New Britain, but they were married there in the building. But from the standpoint of, do we have a list of the who's who of Trinity? No, I wish we did.
Well, that's too bad.
Yeah.
Are there records available through the church?
The church basically took all their records with them. They were alive and well, and as they moved along, they kind of, and where they've gone to at this point, I have no idea. I would love to see some of the questions you've asked. I'd love to be able to go in the books and see what they actually paid to build it and what the contracts look like.
So suppose there are people in our viewing audience tonight who want to get involved in that kind of thing, who like preserving buildings. What advice would you give them?
Say yes. I mean, it's that simple. Really, all you got to do is, almost every town in Connecticut has a historical society. And some people refer to them as the hysterical society. But these folks are true to nature, and they're interested, and they want to see these buildings preserved. We have some old homes in New Britain. Some of the first homes ever built in town are still standing, and they're wood. So there is some opportunity for that kind of preservation. But any local history room, any local historical association clearly can say, we have these projects over here, talk to Bill or Mary who's doing something. So there's opportunity. We're always looking for volunteers to work the theater. We look for volunteers to sell popcorn. I mean, whatever.
Sure,
I mean, it's
volunteer driven.
Primarily. I mean, we do have a few people on the paid staff, but minimal. It really is very minimal.
Well, I really want to commend you for getting involved to preserve history. I think history is a critical part of our lives, and without our history, the future seems pretty uncertain. You have to know where you've been to know where you're going. So, especially in preserving masterpieces, and that's what that building is.
Yes.
It's a masterpiece of craftsmanship.
Yes.
It's wonderful to have that building there, and we're very happy that you were able to be a part of actually preserving it. And I'm sure the people of New Britain and people of goodwill all around our viewing audience will be very much in your debt for doing that.
Have them come down and take a look at the place. It's
Absolutely.
worth the trip.
Absolutely will. That's all the time we have for tonight's show. My thanks to my guest, Gary Robinson, for sharing his story. Our stories are as different as each snowflake and are as beautiful and numerous as the stars. Everybody has a story. What's yours? Until next time, good night.